Chapter 13. Mykonos, Greece. August 18th. The sun was cruel. It glared mercilessly down upon the island through a sky burned clear of clouds or any moisture at all. Though there was wind off the ocean, it did little more than scour the village and its people. It was only a few degrees shy of 100, close enough so that merely breathing the superheated air was enough to scorch your throat. The entire island seemed drained completely of color and life, as though the very earth had been exsanguinated along with the young girl, the girl whose parents had wanted her to stay close by. Though the Watcher's Council told them she might be the one, she might be chosen. Sophie and Yenna stood at the side of a dusty dirt road that made its way gradually into hills above the village, far from the blue-green brilliance of the ocean below. The wind kicked up the dust of the road, and Sophie covered her nose and mouth the best she could, slitting her eyes as she peered down the road, through the heat haze rising above it, for the funeral procession. The church was down there, itself just as bleached and lifeless as the rest of the village. They could hear the bells. Yenna was silent beside her, and Sophie did not blame her. It had been made clear that they were not welcome at the service. It pained her greatly to know this, but the slayer could not have said she was surprised. No matter what the reality of the situation, to the dead girl's parents all that mattered was that outsiders had come to their village and brought death and terror in their wake. Their daughter had been bled dry and then decapitated, her corpse left to rot. Sophie remembered having thought of the girl, Valerie Vorsaz, as bait, and shuddered with guilt and horror. Though there was nothing she could have done to save the girl, she could not shake the feeling she was somehow culpable, almost as if she had been with Spike and Drusilla when they had performed their latest atrocity. They could not have known that Valerie and her watcher, a Brit named Donald Morgan, had returned from Athens even before Havisham and Ruby had arrived in Mykonos. That Spike and Drusilla had executed both the Slayer-in-Waiting and Morgan, and then simply lay in wait for the council operatives. Sophie had asked Yenna why. Why would they have waited? What did they stand to gain? The answer, when it came, was so obvious that Sophie felt embarrassed she had not seen it. The vampires knew the council was gathering its flock, and needed to discover which of the targets on their list was still unaccounted for. Fortunately, according to what she and Yenna had learned in England, Sophie knew there weren't any more. Valerie had been the last. Cold comfort to the girl's parents. Almost as if it were an apparition summoned by her dark ruminations, Sophie saw the funeral procession appear over the edge of a hill, on the road leading from the village and the church to the cemetery at the top of the hill. The church bell still tolled with haunting and nigh impossible slowness, the mournful sound carrying up to them. Now, though, even over the sound of the bells, there came the chanting of the priests and the wailing of the mourners as the funeral procession came on. In the dust swirled up by the scorching breeze, they looked like ghosts themselves, wan spirits in agony as they marched forever in the purgatory of grief. A strong man walked in front, an enormous crucifix hugged to his chest, almost large enough to be Christ on the way up Golgotha. Behind him were two priests in black vestments that hung low enough to drag on the dusty road, their tall black hats trailing long veils on the backs of their heads. Their faces were lined and weathered, but their voices were clear and strong as they prayed loudly in Greek. A younger man in black, possibly also a priest, waved an iron censer back and forth across the road as if the smoke from his burning incense could cleanse the path for the dead girl. 6 large men with the look of fishermen acted as pallbearers, carrying the ravaged corpse in its coffin along the road. Behind them was the girl's family, also dressed all in black. Wailing and crying out to God loud enough to drown out the prayers of the priests, they grew near. Finally there came the rest of the mourners, every soul from the village below, and each one of them draped in black. As the procession passed, Sophie found herself unable to tear her gaze away from the dead girl's mother. The woman had to be supported by her husband and a tall boy who could only be her son. She cried as though her heart were being torn from her chest, and Sophie realized that in a way it had. It was so very foreign to her, for she had lost her parents so young that the aching loneliness remained, but the real pain and tragedy of it usually escaped her. The ghosts in mourning made their way along the road, ignoring the dust from the road that gave them the aspect of spirits. Once more struck by the wave of guilt, Sophie glanced down at the sun-bleached dirt road and thought of war. Hitler had not reached this place yet. The Nazis' war to conquer Europe might never get this far. Mykonos was thus far untouched by a conflict that was consuming the world. But that did not mean war had not come to this little island village. It had. The war against darkness had touched these people, and it had cost them. "Sophie," Yenna whispered. The slayer looked up, blinking against the harsh sun, and saw that they had been noticed. The grieving mother was glaring at them. With a cry of fury, the woman broke away from her husband and son, away from the procession taking her only daughter to her final rest, and swept across the road toward them. Every muscle in Sophie's body tensed. She wanted to withdraw, feeling now like not merely an intruder, but some sort of perverse voyeur. But it was too late. Valerie's mother lifted her black veil to reveal a face as lined and weathered as many of the fishermen. Her eyes blazed with hatred and grief, and her eyes were red and moist, but there were no tears. Hatred. The woman blamed them. Never mind the corpses of Havisham, Ruby, and Morgan, awaiting return to England for burial. It was her daughter in that coffin, her daughter whose head had been torn from her body. To her, Sophie and Yenna were the council. To her, they had killed her little girl. 4 feet from where Sophie stood with her watcher, the woman stopped, hacked something up from her throat, and spat a bowl of yellow phlegm into the dirt at their feet. Then, with a final, hateful glance, she returned to the procession. They continued up the dirt road as it wound up the hill. The wind kicked up again, swirling dust into the insufferable air, and the receding mourners were ghosts again. Down in the village, the church bells had stopped ringing. Sophie felt the first hot tear spill down her cheek, cutting a clean line through the grime from the road on her face, and then she began to weep in earnest. After a moment, Yenna reached out to her and pulled her into an embrace. They stood like that for several minutes, until Sophie finally insisted they get off the road. She did not know how long the funeral would take, and she had no desire to be there at the roadside when the mourners returned. London, England, August 20th. The 4th-floor meeting chamber in the house on Great Russell Street had been utterly transformed. The table stood against the wall opposite the windows, chairs stacked atop it. The rest of the room was now occupied by 2 rows of cots, and upon those cots, 9 young girls who feared for their lives. In the second cot of the second row, Ariana de la Croix slept fitfully, shuddering beneath the rough sheets, and not because she was cold. On the contrary, it was warm and stuffy inside that converted chamber, now more akin to a barracks. Ariana murmured, face contorted into an expression of fear and disgust. In her dream, she was already dead. Dead and buried and risen again, and hungry for blood and life and screams. The girl's eyes snapped open, and she felt as though she could not take a breath. It made sense, in those mist-shrouded moments just after waking from a nightmare. She was dead, thus she could not breathe. Perfect sense. But her heart hammered painfully in her chest, pulse racing so fast she thought she might burst, and then she knew she was alive and her breath came back to her in heaving gasps. Ariana did not scream, though she felt the urge to do so. Instead, she covered her mouth with one hand and shuddered into a series of sobs, despair overwhelming her. When she could control her body, though not yet her tears, she managed to sit up on her cot. She looked around the sterile room with its stifling, stale air and tried to slow her breathing, to get more control of herself. It was dark, save for the light from the city outside the windows. In that pallid illumination, she glanced around at the other girls. Ariana's native language was French, but the council required slayers-in-waiting to learn English. Unfortunately, some of the girls had only just begun to study that language, and so she had not been able to get to know them at all. Others had become almost instantly like sisters to her. On the cot adjacent to hers in the next row was Eleanor Boudreau, who hailed from America. She was a smart, serious girl who, nevertheless, seemed inclined to watch out for the others in an almost motherly way. Down the end of her own row, farthest from the door, Isabel Cortez lay on her back with her limbs splayed wildly about her, mouth open, sleeping as peacefully as an infant. The girls from Barcelona spoke English only a little, but had quickly become Ariana's friend and confidant. Part of her wanted to wake the other girls. Ariana would not feel so alone then, so vulnerable. As she sat in the dark, she felt as though she were being watched, that there were things lurking on the shadows of the night that were stalking her. The terrifying truth was that, in a sense, it was true. A tingle ran up her spine and she shuddered, and fresh tears sprang to her eyes. If she were to wake Isabel and Eleanor, she would not be alone with her fear. And yet in some way she felt that whatever cruel evil menaced her as she sat on the cot in her thin white shift was no threat to the others while they slept. But if she woke them, it could take them then. Her fear could cost them their lives. Absurd, she knew, but she realized she had to master those fears on her own. There was another reason she did not want to wake them, however. Ariana feared that if she did, she might reveal to them the embarrassing truth, the way in which she and her watcher, Charles, had almost thrown their lives away through arrogance. Their respect was important to her, and she planned to hold that secret close to her heart forever. Together they talked about so many things, but not that. Instead, she prodded Eleanor to talk about the Slayer, whom only she among them all had met. It was a fascinating subject, though a morbid one as well. For one of them to become Slayer, Sophie Cartensen had to die. It was an unnerving thought. Ariana was also fascinated by her discovery that not all of them wanted the job. Isabel seemed to have accepted that possibility only because if she was chosen and given the gifts of the chosen one, it would be ignoble of her to refuse. Others dreaded the possibility more outwardly, but had been almost coerced by the council, their obligations explained to them. Others wanted it badly, but none so badly as Ariana. Ever since she had learned about the council and the chosen one, she had hoped that one day the duty would fall to her. Now, though, her fear had given her second thoughts. That, and the fact that now that she had met someone to whom the Slayer was a real person, it seemed hideous to wish for another girl to die so that she might be chosen. It was all so confusing. Once more she looked around at the other girls. Not for the first time. She thought how fortunate they all were to have survived this long. They were being hunted. Unless Sophie copped to Spike and Drusilla, there was no indication of when they would cease to be so. I can't leave like this, Ariana thought, arms wrapped tightly around herself, cross-legged on the cot. I can't stay here forever. Just being afraid. Softly, she whimpered. Even as she did, she heard a click as someone turned the doorknob, and a squeak as it began to open. Ariana stiffened, her dream come back to her suddenly. Wide-eyed, she stared at the light from the hallway that appeared in the opening. There was a face there, and she sighed with her relief. It was a familiar face, kind and warm. "John," she whispered. Gently, so as not to wake the others, John Travers stepped into the room and over to Ariana's cot. "What is it?" she asked worriedly. "I'm on watch," he told her. I thought I heard you cry out. Are you all right?" In the dark, she studied the way the lights from outside glinted off his eyes, and the firm cut of his jaw. He was at least 7 or 8 years her senior, but Ariana thought John Travers was the most handsome, intelligent, and soulful man she had ever met. She searched his gaze for something more than just quiet concern, and was sad that it had found nothing. "I had a nightmare," she whispered. "Silly, I know." "Anyone would have nightmares with what's going on," he comforted her, patting her hand sweetly. "Between our own crisis, the losses we have suffered, and the war on, I've had more than my share, I dare say." Ariana nibbled her bottom lip thoughtfully. She knew what he meant. The Nazis had been bombing the south of England regularly for at least a week. Nobody knew if they would target London next, but there was a great deal of suspicion that it was only a matter of time. As if he could read her thoughts, John leaned forward to catch her eyes. There was a bit of a smile at the corners of his mouth, and she was happy to see it there, for it was a first in the brief time she had known him. "Trust me, you're in more danger from German bombs than vampires here. The appropriate spells have been cast to prevent them from entering again, and there's a veritable battalion of watchers and operatives here to protect you." Ariana smiled in return. She glanced about the room and shuddered once more. "Do you think I could sit to watch with you for a bit?" she asked, pleading with her eyes but keeping her voice steady. "I don't think I could go back to sleep just yet, and I'd like some company, just to talk to someone." John blinked, a bit surprised, but then his sweet smile returned. "It would be my pleasure, Miss Delacroix," he told her. She pulled on the robe that lay on the foot of the cot, then took the hand he offered her and rose to her feet. "Please," she said, "call me Ariana." Athens, Greece, August 23rd. The sky was an ugly gray. The rain drizzled as though it were reluctant to fall, seeping out of the sky. Sophie and Yana sat across from each other in a dingy taverna, eating tzatziki and souvlaki, and wishing time would pass more quickly. In a sense, theirs was a victory. Though many had died, others had been saved, and Spike and Drusilla had been thwarted. But Sophie could not allow herself even the tiniest feeling of satisfaction. Not with the aftermath of Valerie Vorsaz's death, so fresh in her memory, and particularly not with the vampire still on the loose. All the joy had been leached from her, the same way that the rain and dingy skies had stolen the life from the day. Even the food was tasteless to her, as if the rest of the world only existed in a kind of ephemeral shade of reality. When Sophie had left her souvlaki untouched for several minutes, she began to feel Yena's gaze upon her. She glanced up to find her watcher staring at her forlornly, worry clearly etched upon her brow. The Slayer spoke first, however. "Do you think they'll try?" she asked obliquely. "Do you think they'd be that daring?" Yena shook her head slowly. "I do not dare try to protect them," she replied. "My instinct says no. That Spike and Drusilla will content themselves with the anguish they have already wrought and go about their business. But would it surprise me if they attacked the council directly? Not at all." Sophie felt her own expression harden, her jaw set angrily. Damned Nazis, she thought, for it was the war that had held them up so far. They dared not return to England across the continent, and it had taken days, even after the arrival of the operatives sent to retrieve the corpses of the councilmen at Mykonos, to line up a freighter willing to carry them to Great Britain by sea. Even then, the ship's captain had made it plain he would sail round the southern tip of England and make port on the western shore, away from the German bombers. The need to return to the house in Great Russell Street, to be there in case Spike and Drusilla dared the unthinkable, pulled at her. Though their departure was mere hours away, Sophie mentally urged the operatives who must even now be loading coffins on board the freighter to move ever faster. It was day, but with the dark sky and the rain and the candles guttering weakly on each of the taverna's tables, it felt as coldly ominous as the lonely pre-dawn hours ever had. Suddenly determined to be off, Sophie pushed back her chair and stood. "We should go. If they're prepared to depart sooner, I want to be there and ready to leave." The eyes of the mostly Greek clientele seared her. She was so out of place with her long legs and blonde mane. Sophie ignored them as best she could. Her long skirt and dark blouse had been enough of a compromise with the attitudes of the locals. She had a small handbag with her, and as she slipped its strap over her shoulder, she realized that Yena had not moved to respond. Not an inch. "Yena?" she began, glancing at the watcher. The woman's green eyes were glazed and empty. She sagged in her chair, head lolling slightly sideways. "Not now. Not another one." Sophie cursed under her breath and went to her mentor's side to make certain she did not fall over. A minute passed, perhaps less, before Yena's eyelids flared and it was clear the vision was over. But it was several minutes after that before the watcher's eyes began to focus again. It was the longest Yenna had ever taken to recover from one of her clairvoyant episodes, and Sophie's heart broke a little more as she considered the ramifications of that. "Another vision?" Sophie asked quietly, though she knew the answer. Yenna nodded. Her pallor was ashen. The skin around her eyes crinkled in dismay. Her lips pursed as though she might speak. Instead, she shook her head. "What was it?" Sophie asked worriedly. After a moment's pause, Yenna let out a long, resigned sigh. There was pain in her eyes when she regarded Sophie again. "Please sit," she said, an ache in her voice Sophie had never heard before. Her anxiety growing, Sophie did as she was asked. "I am here with you, Yenna. Focus on me. Remember who you are," she said softly, laying a hand over Yenna's on the table. "Now what is it? What did you see?" Chin raised, expression grim, Yenna closed her eyes a moment, then almost seemed to shudder as she opened them again. "We cannot return to London. Not yet. It'll be hard traveling in the midst of the war, but the Germans have their sights set on England now, and France is a dangerous but less volatile place. We have contacts with the French underground as well, and that should help." "I don't understand," Sophie said, with a shake of her head. "Where are you suggesting we go?" "Home," Yenna replied. "We must go to Copenhagen." Sophie smiled. A warmth sprang within her to cut the chill dread within her. As sudden as it had come, however, the smile was erased by the grave expression on Yenna's face. The question was on Sophie's lips. "Why?" But even before she could voice it, she had the answer. "There's another Slayer in waiting there," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her frown deepened as she stared at her watcher. "But she wasn't on the list." To her credit, Yenna did not look away from Sophie's intense gaze. "That was the Council's decision. The girl in Copenhagen was kept off the list completely with the idea that, should her existence somehow become known to you, the knowledge that a candidate to become Slayer upon your death was so close by, there in the city with you, would dishearten and demoralize you." Sophie glared at her, stomach churning with anger. "You deceived me." "A sin of omission," Yenna replied, though not lightly. "I did as I was instructed. The odds are greatly against this girl becoming the next Slayer in any case. It was thought that no good could come of your knowing." "Oh, I see that," Sophie said, voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "Particularly now that secrecy could cost the girl her life. I presume that your visions showed that she was in danger?" Yenna nodded. "Spike and Drusilla are on their way to Copenhagen even now. They must have learned about her from poor Mr. Haversham." Emotions swirling in her head, a pain thrumming in her heart, Sophie stood up again. She felt destiny rushing toward her, dark and inescapable. Sophie did not look at Yenna, nor did she even notice the other patrons in the taverna now. "Come then," the Slayer said, her voice a low growl. "Let's go home."